Good evening, folks. Welcome to Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. I'm Emily Levine. I'm the Interpretive Program Supervisor here, and as always, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to the Carriage House this evening. We are here for a very special Evacuation Day Lecture. This is a longstanding annual tradition. This year, of course, marking the 250th anniversary of the British Army's withdrawal from Boston. So I'm very pleased to welcome back historian and author and friend of the site, J.L. Bell, to discuss what happens next. The site, now known as Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, was really a crucible of American independence, serving as George Washington's first military headquarters of the Revolution. It's a place where Washington would set the stage in many ways for continental unity around the common cause of independence. And we're really grateful to J.L. Bell this evening and always for being at the forefront of exploring this house's indelible connection to the founding era and its many enduring meetings. After tonight's event, although tonight's event really marks the conclusion in some ways of the 250th anniversary of George Washington's Cambridge headquarters, we are looking forward to continuing these explorations of meaning over the coming months and beyond. So a couple of logistical notes before I hand it over for tonight's talk. Restrooms are available in the visitor center. So you just go out these doors right over to the yellow house in the back door there. We've got a couple of restrooms. We are live streaming. Audio in the room is now live. So any questions that you might ask at the end will be audible to our considerable online audience. We're really looking forward to your questions following the presentation. And while I have you, I will briefly switch gears and preview the event that will be taking place same time, same place a week from now. If you are interested, please join us for Pricked and Painted, Tattooing in the 19th Century, presented in collaboration with History Cambridge, where public historian and traditional handpoke tattoo artist Owen Payette McGarry will lead a conversation on methods of tattooing in the 1800s and demonstrate some. All right, back to Evacuation Day. Thank you again to J.L. Bell for being here to connect us to this really relevant history. Thank you for joining us this evening, for being part of this community, and to the Friends of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, for supporting this annual event and making it possible. Now, let's welcome J.L. Bell.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, as Emily said, to the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, which supports, pays for this event, and has been doing so for many years. Thank you all for coming out at the end of the Evacuation Day season. This week, we celebrated the 250th anniversary of the British military's departure from Boston, what we in Boston have come to call Evacuation Day. That was the culmination of General George Washington's work at this house, his headquarters. For the Americans, it was a successful end to the first campaign of the Revolutionary War, a campaign which had lasted 11 months. Nobody foresaw that the war would last for another 7 years. Tonight, I'm going to talk about how General Washington and the war and the American colonies had changed in those 7 months and what lay ahead immediately in the next 3 months. This is one of many pictures of General George Washington watching the British Army embark from Boston on their ships. Thousands of redcoat soldiers piled onto aboard Royal Navy warships, troop transports, merchant vessels, over 100 ships. With all those military men went over 1,000 loyalists, people from Boston, from Massachusetts, and other parts of America who had come under the protection of the British military and did not feel safe staying. For the next several days, the fleet actually didn't leave. It hovered in the outer harbor. And even on March 20th, some British engineers went on to Castle Island in the harbor and blew up the fortress there so that the Americans could not use it. The ships then moved out onto the Nantasket Road, which was still within the Cape Cod Bay, and locals were worried about that. They were just hovering out there waiting for the chance to come back and attack Boston or attack some other coastal settlement for a while. And on March 24th, General Washington even thought about sending a fire raft, some sort of flaming debris, to drive the ships away. But finally, on March 25th, the first set of British ships headed out to the north. And 2 days later, the whole fleet sailed away, and they were headed for Halifax, Nova Scotia, a deep water port dominated by the British military, a true safe harbor for the army and the loyalists. There, General William Howe would wait for orders from London. And back in November, this man, Lord George Germain, had become the Secretary of State for North America. So he was handling the policy and the details of how the war should be run. He was a hardliner. He wanted to prosecute the war and bring the rebellious colonies back into line. And already by this point, the British government had contracted with several German states, such as Hesse, to hire soldiers to augment the British army in the fighting. The government also commissioned Admiral Richard Howe, the general's brother, to join him, and they would command the army and the navy in North America. They would also attempt to come up with a peace plan, but a peace plan on London's terms. Admiral Howe would bring a larger army and a fleet from the Royal Navy across the Atlantic, while General Howe was up in Nova Scotia regrouping his forces. And here in Cambridge, General Washington was already preparing for the next stage of the war. Even before the British left Boston, he had already sent some troops, the riflemen from the Middle Colonies, to New York to guard the harbor there. On March 17th, as the redcoats left, he ordered selected Continental troops to go into the town. General John Sullivan led troops into Charlestown and then ferried them across the river into the North End, and General Israel Putnam led more troops up the Boston Neck. Washington had to tell the generals to make sure those soldiers have all had smallpox so that they are not vulnerable to that disease. So the first 2,000 men sent into Boston were picked to be have a good immune systems. Then finally, Washington himself joined them on March 18th. And on March 19th, the next day, he wrote about the fortifications that the British had left behind. Their works all standing, upon examination of which, especially at Bunker's Hill, we find amazingly strong. 20,000 men could not have carried it against 100,000 had that work been well defended. The town of Boston was almost impregnable from every avenue fortified. And that's a significant admission from Washington, because just a month before, he had been advocating attacks on the town. And in fact, attacks on ice across the river into the town, which meant with no shelter at all for his men. And here he was saying, well, actually, that would probably not have been a good idea. He didn't tie those things together, but he clearly saw that the town was much stronger than he had anticipated. However, because he had not done that sort of attack, he had put cannon up on Dorchester Heights. The siege had ended without many people being killed, without Boston being burned down or otherwise destroyed. Nonetheless, Washington actually had hoped for a big battle. On March 27th, he wrote to his Virginia friend Landon Carter, "I can scarce forbear lamenting the disappointment that General Howe hadn't tried to attack the Heights, as we were prepared for them at all points, and had a chosen corps of 4,000 men with boats ready to push into Boston." So he was disappointed. But by this point, he was already looking ahead. On Monday, March 18th, one brigade of the army marched toward New York to join the riflemen there, and 3 more brigades followed, the last one on April 4th. And another important part of his retinue, Martha Washington, she had dinner with a merchant in Boston on April 2nd and then headed south within a day or two after that. Martha and her son and his wife, they traveled separately from the general. They went out through Hartford and then down, where he followed the army through Providence. And they all reached New York on April 17th. Washington had looked ahead, so he had expected the next campaign would not be as static as the siege, where he got to live in this one house for basically 9 months. So he had asked his military secretary to buy him a tent in Philadelphia, a set of camp equipage, tents, and a baggage wagon. And those were to be completed by the end of March. So he was expecting a different campaign coming up. He had also formed a special unit called the Commander-in-Chief's Guard, or the Life Guard, which was a company assigned to guard the headquarters papers and equipment and himself. And its captain, a lawyer from Marblehead named Caleb Gibbs, quickly came to function as another aide de camp. So he was creating, having been here for 9 months, he is creating the infrastructure to be able to have a moving campaign if that's what the war required. On April 1st, the steward managing life at headquarters here, Timothy Austin, bought 2 brass padlocks and a trunk, most likely things for the general to pack his stuff into, to pack his papers into, and secure, send them out. Mr. Austin closed out his accounts on April 4th, paying off the regular household suppliers and staff like Elizabeth Chapman, who was a teenager who was working here because she had been burned out of her house in Charlestown. And then he paid himself the last £6, 10 shillings and 6 pence, closed off his books, and then, the way these things work, he got a couple more bills, and so he had to add them at the bottom. The cost of 2 bushels of oysters and some beef. Another last-minute piece of business here in Cambridge involved Harvard College. The college scrambled to honor Washington for his eminent services in the cause of his country and for minimizing damage to the campus when it was being used as barracks for the Continental Army. The corporation, the overseers, they convened a special meeting in Watertown on April 3rd, and they voted to make the general an honorary Doctor of Laws. This was the first time Harvard had awarded any sort of law degree. This was the first honorary degree it gave to somebody who never even graduated from college. And it's the first degree that it granted outside of its regular commencement schedule in July. And in fact, I'm not even sure how the college got this diploma to General Washington, because according to the Reverend Samuel Cooper, he signed the document as a college official on April 4th. Here's his signature. And then he went to Cambridge PM to wait on the general and take leave. And the minister, when he got here, found that Washington had set out for Boston and from thence to New York. So somehow they must have chased after him or mailed this or something, because they eventually got the diploma to Washington. As far as we know, he never said a word about it. So it might have been more important to the college to give it to him than for him to receive it. But he did keep it. And it was still in Washington's papers. From March 1776 on, Massachusetts, therefore, was free from British control. It was still at war, and that caused some problems, some drama. On June 17th, 2 ships called the George and the Arabella arrived in Boston Harbor. They were carrying about 200 men from the 71st Regiment of Highlanders in the British Army. And the captains of those ships had not gotten the word that Boston was now in Patriot hands. They hadn't realized that General Howe had left. So there was a brief fight with ships and guns on shore, and eventually the ships had to surrender, and the soldiers were all kept as prisoners of war, and their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, he was held out in the Concord jail for several months. The next large mass of British soldiers to come into Massachusetts, the next British Army in the state, would be in the fall of 1777, and these were the prisoners surrendered at the Battle of Saratoga, which came to be called the Convention Army. And several of the houses here along Brattle Street were used to house officers from that army, from those prisoners of war, and the barracks that had been built for the Continental Army in Somerville, on Prospect Hill and Winter Hill. Those were then used to house these prisoners of war for the winter of 1777-78. But that's a story for a couple of years from now, perhaps. General Washington, we'll return to him, he reached New York City on April 14th. He established a new headquarters in a mansion called Richmond Hill and started looking ahead. This was just about 10 months since he had accepted the job as commander-in-chief. He had pushed the British Army out, though, to be fair, General Howe was already eager to go. Yet Washington knew that he hadn't defeated the enemy. The British were still a formidable force. There was still no settlement with the British government. And Washington knew he hadn't even overseen a major battle. The major battle of the Boston campaign was the Battle of Bunker Hill that happened before he even arrived. But he had been able to use his time here, I think, to learn some important lessons about what his responsibilities were. He learned how to administer the command of a large army. In the late 1750s, he had been in charge of the Virginia Regiment, a small subordinate force within the British Army fighting the 7 Years' War. He had observed commanders at work, but he was not in charge. He did not have all the responsibilities or all the powers. He had figured out, by imitation of what he'd seen and by trial and error, he had figured out how to run a military headquarters here in Cambridge. Most of all, that meant he realized that for what he was trying to do, he had to do good communication with the men, with his fellow generals, with generals in other regions, with the Congress in Philadelphia, and with the colonial and local governments that he was dealing with, the government of Massachusetts, the government of Connecticut, and so on. He was overseeing an army spread out across many miles, dependent on a far-flung supply system, and he depended on the approval of various governments. He learned that written communication was vital. So one of the things he learned as setting up this headquarters is he realized that he needed good aides, his military secretary, his aides de camp. He realized that those aides needed to be ready penmen, as he called them, men who could compose letters in genteel prose that read like Washington's own words, and then he could edit them or send them off. They needed good handwriting to be able to copy many copies of these. Back in the spring of 1775, when he was just setting up headquarters, two young men from Virginia had arrived in Cambridge seeking posts in the army, and Washington appointed them as his aides, Edmund Randolph and George Baylor. Randolph was a young lawyer, therefore he was practiced in written communication. In contrast, Baylor turned out he was just a planter's son. He was eager. He wanted to help out. Being an aide de camp was really one of the few jobs open to somebody who was not from New England. So Washington made him an aide. And then he discovered over the months that Baylor was not in the slightest degree a penman, though spirited and willing. He could be serviceable in writing and delivering verbal orders, but that wasn't enough. That was not what he wanted. By the end of the siege, Washington was calling in other officers with professional backgrounds to serve as his headquarters staff. And for the rest of the war, all of Washington's aides were educated young men. He discovered through trial and error, George Baylor being the error, what he needed in headquarters staff. While here in Cambridge, he also figured out which commanders he liked, which generals he enjoyed and could rely on. When he had arrived in Massachusetts, the Continental Congress had already chosen his generals. These weren't men he chose. And at this point in the war, he was working well with the two British generals they had appointed, Charles Lee and Horatio Gates. He knew them from before the war in Virginia. Those men, in fact, had enough experience that he could give them, or he could agree with Congress that they should have independent commands, that Charles Lee could go down to Providence and New York and Charleston and help out there and oversee their defenses, and then later Horatio Gates could go out to New York. Eventually, that sort of autonomy from him would lead to friction, and both those men became rivals later in the war. But at least in this first year, they were all working well. Then there were a bunch of other generals, and Washington had different ideas about those. For the most part, he found that he preferred working with the younger men, even over the older ones. Perhaps, or even because the older ones had more experience and thought they knew what to do. He still admired and put faith in Israel Putnam, who was one of the older generals, but his favorites were people like Nathaniel Greene, John Sullivan of New Hampshire, and Henry Knox, his artillery commander, who was a colonel at this point. And he lost some respect for some of the other generals, such as Joseph Spencer, who had actually left camp and gone back to Connecticut to try to complain about his rank when Washington arrived. And then his predecessor and second in command, Artemus Ward, and William Heath of Massachusetts. These guys were not gung-ho enough for him. On the other hand, they were still generals answering to the Continental Congress, so he couldn't do anything about it. There was, in this season, Washington wrote a letter about Ward that got him in trouble later. On May 9th, as he was in New York, he wrote to General Charles Lee, General Ward, upon the evacuation of Boston, and finding that there was a probability of his removing from the smoke of his own chimney, applied to me and wrote to Congress for leave to resign. Ward had said that he felt too ill for an extended campaign. Washington clearly thought that that was just an excuse. Ward didn't want to leave Massachusetts. He wanted to get out of the army. He happily sent Ward's resignation on to the Congress. And a few days later, Ward came back and said he had changed his mind. And though Congress accepted, not necessarily to Washington's liking, Congress accepted Ward's offer to stay on and put him in charge of the Eastern Department of the war, or New England. In 1792, Washington's letter to Lee that he had written back in 1776, it was published in a book about Lee. And at that time, Washington was the president in Philadelphia, and Artemus Ward was a congressman in Philadelphia. And it looks to me from the sources as if Ward confronted Washington about his remarks from 16 years earlier behind closed doors. And there are different versions of what followed, with no direct statement from either man. But I think that they probably had some sort of frosty exchange, and Ward made it clear that he did not appreciate this. And they kept that between themselves. But this is a demonstration of how Washington was not getting along with everybody. But as the war went on, he was able to gather around him the generals and aides whom he really appreciated most. Washington also had to learn more about the soldiers under him. When he arrived, he didn't like the look of the New England Army. It was too egalitarian, too motley, too demanding. It included black troops as an enslaver from Virginia. That really troubled Washington. But over the months of the siege, Washington came to appreciate those soldiers. And by the end of 1775, he announced that black veterans could re-enlist. He had just, did a total 180 on that question. And then as the fighting moved out of New England, the core of the Continental Army continued to be New England troops. The state that provided the most soldiers for the Continental Army throughout the war was Massachusetts. Now, that said, not all of the Continental troops around Boston went to New York with Washington. A few regiments stayed in Massachusetts. A number of others went north to Canada, as I'll discuss. And some men, it appeared, didn't really share Washington's vision of a national army. I did some work on Colonel Knox's artillery regiment, which in February 1776, as Colonel Knox arrived, took command after his mission out to Lake Champlain. The muster roll for the artillery regiment listed 563 men on duty out of 604 enlisted. In July, after the move to New York, there were only 364 men on duty out of 488 enlisted. So almost a third of the regiment was no longer available to the Army. And among the men who left was the second in command, Lieutenant Colonel William Burbeck, who simply told Knox that he had received his commission from Massachusetts and he wasn't going to leave the province. So there was this sorting out of who exactly was going to be in the Army for the long haul, who actually was going to keep fighting with Washington. Washington's force also shrank because many of the troops during that last month of the siege weren't Continental soldiers, but militiamen. The New England colonies had called up those men for short service in the emergency of pushing out the British. Short service meaning like 3 months or until the emergency was over. So when Washington changed his focus to New York, one of the first things he did was to write to the governments of Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey and tell them to activate their militia as well. Now, at this time, 1776, the Congress was enlisting men in the Army for until the end of the year. That's how long you signed up for. For ideological reasons, the Congress resisted a longer term enlistment. They didn't want a standing army, a permanent army. Washington had gone through the great deal of trouble and a great deal of worry at the end of 1775, early 1776, trying to re-enlist men, trying to hope that they'll come back from going home to their families, worrying that come January 2nd, that the British would be able to sweep out of Boston because he didn't have any soldiers left or not enough soldiers left. He didn't want to go through that again at the end of the next year. And so he lobbied to Congress to provide for long-term appointments, and they didn't do it. They didn't make the change that year. So he had to go through the same thing at the end of 1776. But that was something he had learned, a lesson he was able to put into practice, but only later when Congress agreed. There were also some lessons that Washington didn't learn during the siege of Boston. He was still struggling with what to do about the smallpox, this horrible, deadly disease, and which was spreading around the continent at the time. We were in the middle of a smallpox epidemic. The Army Medical Department, the way it was handling it is if you showed the symptoms of the smallpox as a soldier, you were sent to a hospital that was off, away from the camp, away from everybody else, and had a staff that was already immune. In fact, Washington was so worried about smallpox that in December 1775, he had convinced himself that the British were intending spreading the smallpox amongst us. He thought that the British were using the smallpox virus as a biological weapon. And that fear, as I said earlier, shaped his plans for taking over Boston. He had only immune soldiers go into the town. He understood that inoculation was the safest way to have lifelong immunity from the smallpox, to be deliberately injected with what seemed like a mild case of the disease, to go through the cycle of the pox, and then if you survived, you would be immune for life. But he resisted having the troops inoculated because to the Army, if you take a whole bunch of your men out of service for a month and they have to be they're sick, they're isolated, some of them will die, you certainly don't want them close to the other men. He felt that that was a worse risk than contagion. So for the rest of 1776, he was actively trying to squelch soldiers' own attempts to get themselves inoculated. So when he heard about a private doctor offering inoculations, he actually tried to have that man court-martialed. It wasn't until February 1777 that George Washington felt secure enough from the threat of British attack to change his mind and start a mass inoculation program in the Continental Army, which was successful and which kept this army from becoming badly hurt later in the war as the virus continued to spread across North America and really wreaked havoc in some of the populations where there was not immunity, where there was not inoculation. Now, an even bigger lesson that Washington had not yet learned after the Boston campaign was that his job was not to defeat the British army in a big spectacular battle. For months, he had argued that goal, it should be to defeat the king's troops in a fight, to inflict a lot of damage, just as had happened at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The idea was that the British state could not survive two losses at the level of Bunker Hill, 1,000 casualties in a day. Another such battle, they would realize this war was too costly, and they would stop trying to force a settlement on the Americans. He even told his former secretary on February 1st that it was essential that the troops in Boston should be destroyed. But of course, in the end, they all sailed away. A big spectacular battle was not to be. Now, of course, personally, it would bring glory on him to be this general in the middle of this fighting. He liked to be a brave man in front of the troops. And that was a big reason why he felt disappointment, as I quoted him earlier, at the way the siege ended. For the next 2 years, General Washington kept trying to bring about that decisive battle. He would try on Long Island in September 1776, and he lost. He would try again at Brandywine in September 1777, the biggest land battle of the war, facing up against General Howe again, and he lost. In fact, that time he lost so badly that he lost the American capital, and the Continental Congress had to flee, and he had to spend the whole winter at Valley Forge. That was when Washington became the Fabian general that we remember him as waiting out the British until the right time to strike at Yorktown. In the spring of 1776, as he was setting up his headquarters in New York, he hadn't yet learned that lesson because he had never had a chance to learn it here. Now, as Washington was going to New York, there were other campaigns going on, not under his direct control. In fact, the American incursion into Canada was at its peak in early 1776. We don't usually tell the story that way. Instead, we talk about how General Richard Montgomery and Colonel Benedict Arnold led 2 columns of Continental soldiers north in the fall of 1775, Montgomery from northern New York along the St. Lawrence River, and Arnold up through Maine. And then they met outside Quebec, and they besieged the city, and they finally attacked the city on the last day of the year because all those enlistments were running out. This is why you don't want a 1-year enlistment. And Montgomery was killed. Arnold was wounded. Captain Daniel Morgan, who was in this force, and others were captured. And with that climactic moment, we end the story usually. That was the Northern campaign. In fact, the Continental Army, as soon as they heard about this loss, they thought, we need to send in more soldiers. Montgomery had about 1,700 men. Arnold had about 1,000. During the battle, they had about 1,200 of those men in the fight. During the first 6 months of 1776, historians think, the Continental Army sent about 7,000 more men, more than twice as many as already were there, not even counting the ones who weren't able to fight. But and they were pulling regiments out of Washington's army here in Massachusetts and out from New York to send up to Canada. They also sent some of the top generals, such as John Thomas, the man who had led troops onto Dorchester Heights. He was one of the most respected generals in the Continental Army here in Massachusetts. And we don't remember that effort because it didn't accomplish anything. There wasn't even a doomed battle as it was with Montgomery. Instead, it just fizzled out. The locals did not offer the Continental Army any support because the Continental Army was just paying for things with worthless paper money. The more British troops arrived in May 1776. So quickly, the Americans started to pull back along the St. Lawrence River faster and faster. And the real killer was smallpox. It killed hundreds of men, including General John Thomas, who had died of the disease on June 2nd. And later, it would blind another man who was up there, Colonel James Reed of New Hampshire. And the last Americans were back in New York around the end of June. So General Guy Carleton didn't even try to counterattack on the Americans until the fall of 1776. And then later, General John Burgoyne led a big push down from Canada in 1777. But in the spring of 1776, after all that fighting, after those thousands of men being sent up and everything, the Northern Department is basically back to the way it was before. The British held Quebec, Montreal, Three Rivers, all those settlements, and the Americans held New York. There was also a fight down in South Carolina in early 1776. Charleston was the fourth largest port in the 13 colonies. It was a center of wealth. And General Henry Clinton had sailed south from Boston with a portion of the troops in January. Then General Cornwallis arrived from Britain with more ships and more men, and Clinton and Cornwallis agreed to attack Charleston in June. The Battle of Sullivan's Island took place on June 28th. It ended in a British defeat, mostly because of environmental factors. They had trouble getting around the islands, and then the American fortifications were made with these palmetto logs, which were very strong and bounced back the British cannonballs. So even today, the South Carolina flag honors the palmetto tree for having saved Charleston in 1776. British came back a few years later, took the whole town, but for 1776, this was a defeat for the British. Clinton and Cornwallis sailed away, heading back north. The upshot of those campaigns in Boston, in Canada, and in Charleston was that in the spring, late spring of 1775, there were almost no British soldiers left in the 13 colonies represented at the Continental Congress, all the way from New Hampshire down to Georgia. All the royal governors had been driven away. All these territories were being governed by patriot legislatures, some of which were official, some of which were sort of ad hoc provincial congresses, things like that. The British military still held only one spot along the Atlantic coast. And let's zoom in to see that spot. This little peninsula off of the coast of New Jersey called Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook Lighthouse is on that peninsula. It was a lighthouse that guided ships into New York Harbor. So you could come off the Atlantic and you saw the light here, and then you knew that you would turn and go up to Manhattan. In April 1776, Lord Tryon, New York's last royal governor, had gotten onto a ship and anchored off of Sandy Hook, along with some Royal Navy warships. And there was also a British Army sergeant named Matthew Hayes, who was captured during the Battle of Lexington and Concord and held for a while in Concord jail, and then he broke out and escaped and made his way to Sandy Hook Lighthouse. Now, General Washington didn't want to leave that lighthouse under royal control. So he didn't want it to be guiding the Royal Navy into New York Harbor. And in late June, a contingent of the Continental Army attacked the lighthouse with soldiers, with cannon, but they couldn't dislodge the British. And the walls of the structure that had been built up to withstand storms, well, they withstood cannonballs. And so the Continentals were driven back. And the Royal Navy, plus Sergeant Hayes, kept control of that lighthouse, which is going to turn out to be significant. Incidentally, Sandy Hook Lighthouse is now part of Gateway National Historical Park. So it belongs to us, the American people, at last. The fact that a royal fleet could hang out in New York Harbor and hover, and also still hover off Boston and get into Charleston easily, so it showed that the Royal Navy was still dominant at sea. And so all those colonies, they were felt endangered from an invasion from the sea, and all of them were still argued, no, we can't send all of our troops and all of our military material to Washington in New York. We need to keep some of it to guard ourselves at home. Nevertheless, that situation meant that Americans were not dealing with royal forces around them. They could see the possibility of a new political order. And that brings me to the biggest change that became clear in the months between the evacuation of Boston in March 1776 and say 4 months later, although that change had been building up beforehand. When the war began, the provincial forces in New England and the Continental forces weren't fighting for independence, certainly not explicitly. They argued that the American colonies deserved more autonomy within the British Empire, autonomy that they felt they had before Parliament's new taxes started in the 1760s. The Continentals and their officials still continued to swear oaths to King George III. They still prayed for the king's health. This is the Continental Congress's olive branch petition to the king, approved by the Continental Congress on the 5th of July, 1775. And you can see some signatures, which should look pretty familiar. John Hancock, John Adams, Stephen Hopkins, and so on. This petition was asking the king to personally intervene in the crisis between the colonies and Parliament, and to settle peace in every part of our dominions so that Americans could continue to being the most dutiful subjects and the most affectionate colonists. That was just after George Washington arrived in Cambridge to lead the army. But he shared those sentiments, even though he was now going to be attacking the British soldiers. Back on May 31st, Washington wrote to a friend in London, "We do not, nor cannot yet prevail upon ourselves to call enemy soldiers the king's troops." Instead, he used the term ministerial troops, meaning that those men were being ordered to fight by the prime minister in London and the other ministers, but not by the king. And that meant that they could still see themselves as being loyal to the king, being loyal to Britain in some way. It was just these corrupt politicians in London that were getting in the way. But in November, while here, Washington did start to refer to the king's troops as well as the ministerial troops. We can still see the same tension being built up in how Captain William Palfrey composed a prayer for an Anglican service at Christ Church here in Cambridge at the start of 1776. "Most heartily we beseech thee to look down with mercy on his majesty George III, open his eyes and enlighten his understanding, that he may pursue the true interest of the people over whom thou in thy providence have placed him. Remove from him all wicked, corrupt men and evil counselors, that his throne may be established in justice and righteousness." So they're still praying for the king. They just didn't like anybody around the king. And likewise, at the end of 1775, the new Continental Navy flag is based on the Union, has the Union Jack Canton, the symbol of the British Union, but with 13 stripes, showing that this is a separate part of the British Union. It symbolized the united colonies within the British Empire. But already, as the year turned, some men were discussing the possibility of those colonies becoming independent, if only as a last resort, as long as the government in London continued to clamp down on them. And some of those men discussing independence were in Washington's own circle. Ironically, the generals who supported American independence first and most vociferously were the two men from Britain. They had seen the royal government up close, and they were sick of it. Even before Horatio Gates moved to America, a friend joked that he had become a red-hot Republican. And in December 1775, Gates told Benjamin Franklin that the Congress ought to establish American independence. On March 8th, he wrote to John Adams about, "Now is the time for an act of independency." And the other British general, Charles Lee, was for once less provocative in his language, but he also started in January lobbying members of the Congress for independence. And yet another voice in this House breaking with Britain was Stephen Moylan, the muster master general of the Continental Army, who served as one of Washington's aides. He had been born in Ireland and he was a Catholic, so it wasn't as much of a shift for him as for some others to go against the establishment in London. But on January 2nd, he wrote to a friend, "I should like vastly to go with full and ample powers from the United States of America to Spain to seek foreign assistance. So not only was Moylan imagining a diplomatic mission for himself on behalf of an independent country, but he was even coming up with a name for that country, the United States of America. This is the earliest use of that phrase that anybody has found. Now, what made men like Moylan and Lee start to advocate from breaking from the king was, in fact, that things that the king himself was doing as part of his official duties. In August, he had signed a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. He had refused that petition from the Continental Congress that I showed before, the olive branch petition. He insisted on supporting all of his ministers. There was no difference between the ministerial policy and the king's policy. And on October 26th, King George opened a parliament with a speech that declared, "The rebellious war is now become more general and is manifestly carried on for the purpose of establishing an independent empire." So he was accusing the Americans of trying to become independent at the same time that they were still saying, no, we don't want independence. And of course, he announced also that the government was going to hire Germans to come and fight the Americans. When news of all those royal policies reached North America, public opinion turned openly against remaining in the British Empire. Washington himself wrote sarcastically on January 4th, "We are at length favored with a sight of His Majesty's most gracious speech, breathing sentiments of tenderness and compassion for his deluded American subjects. We know now the ultimatum of British justice." And later that month, General Horatio Gates reported, "The King's speech has had a noble effect of fixing all the wavering in the cause of freedom in America." Basically, since George III had accused the rebellious colonists of seeking independence, they had little to lose by actually seeking independence. Another factor in rising support for complete independence from the British system was Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, published in Philadelphia in early January 1776. And Paine lambasted the very idea of monarchy as unnecessary and corrupt. And a copy of this pamphlet arrived here at Cambridge headquarters on January 21st, according to General Gates. And General Lee recommended Common Sense to Washington as a masterly, irresistible performance, adding, "I owe myself convinced by the arguments of the necessity of separation." And at the end of the month, Washington himself was hinting at the same sentiment. He had obviously read this. He told a former military secretary that more British naval attacks on the American coast, added to the sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning contained in the pamphlet Common Sense, will not leave numbers at a loss to decide upon the propriety of a separation. He was still worried about popular opinion. He wanted to know that the Americans, especially those outside of New England, would actually support independence. And he had his brother-in-law write to him from Virginia in March. "The opinion for independency seems to be gaining ground, and indeed most of those who have read the pamphlet Common Sense say it's unanswerable." And Washington passed this news on to his former secretary, Joseph Reed, in Philadelphia. "My countrymen," meaning Virginians, "I know from their form of government and steady attachment heretofore to royalty, will come reluctantly into the idea of independency. But time and persecution bring many wonderful things to pass, and by private letters, which I have lately received from Virginia, I find Common Sense is working a wonderful change there in the minds of many men." The general still worried about the Congress taking steps ahead of the American people, something they weren't prepared for. But he felt that ordinary citizens were coming around to the idea of independence. Now, in fact, as a wealthy elite man, Washington was generally more cautious and conservative and more tied to Britain than many American colonists. Some of the soldiers in his army were actually well ahead of their commander in throwing off their traditional loyalty to the king. Back in September, for instance, Private Daniel McCurtain of Maryland had written in his journal during the siege of Boston about it being the King's Damnation Day, or Coronation Day, as they call it. There's nothing like fighting a war against the British government to make you feel less loyal to the British government. And by the spring of 1776, there was a clear change in what Americans wanted and were ready to fight for. In American scripture, the MIT historian Pauline Maier traced how sentiment in independence bubbled up from within American society, pressuring the Continental Congress. In the spring of 1776, town meetings and provincial congresses were discussing the prospect of breaking with Britain, and many issued resolutions or instructions favoring independence, more or less strong terms, sometimes conditional, sometimes, yes, we definitely want this, sometimes this is definitely the time. In Declaration, William Hoagland, I don't even know what that is. William Hoagland wrote about the popular pressure for independence right outside the Pennsylvania State House where the Congress was meeting. The delegates even had a name for this social force, the people out of doors. They wanted independence. And these discussions across colonial society led to the biggest change in General Washington's mission. On June 7th, following instructions from the Virginia Convention, Richard Henry Lee introduced a measure in the Continental Congress that these united colonies are and have a right to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. The Congress started to discuss that motion secretly by making itself into a committee of the whole that didn't have to record its debates. It also named a committee of 5, headed by Thomas Jefferson, to write a document declaring why it broke with Britain, if in fact that's how the discussion ended up. Delegates consulted with their legislatures back home. Was this the right time? Did they need to set up some sort of formal alliance among the colonies first? Did they need to set up a national government first? Even as the Congress delegates debated in June, the war went on. On June 25th, more ships arrived in New York Harbor, coming from Halifax, guided in by the Sandy Hook Light. And on one of those ships carried General Sir William Howe, 3 months after he'd left Massachusetts Bay. And he met with Governor Tryon on a Royal Navy warship in the harbor. And then more ships arrived, lots more. On June 29th, Private McCurtain of Maryland wrote in his diary, "This morning, as I was upstairs, I spied, as I peeped out the bay, something resembling a wood of pine trees trimmed. In about 10 minutes, the whole bay was as full of shipping as ever could be. I do declare that I thought all of London was in a float." And that wasn't even the main fleet. Admiral Howe was on his way across the ocean with even more ships and thousands more soldiers, the largest expeditionary force that the British government had ever assembled. On July 2nd, British troops started to come ashore on Staten Island. There were now British soldiers in America again. July 2nd, that very same day, in Philadelphia, the 13 colonies at the Continental Congress voted unanimously, with one abstention, to declare independence from Great Britain. General Washington and the Continental Army would now have to fight a bigger army to make that independence happen. Thank you. So that's a very eventful 3 months between when Washington left here on April 4th and July 4th in Philadelphia, and in New York. I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments. Yeah.
What was the concept of state when the general was writing about it? Was he thinking of it as an independent country? 13 independent countries, and he used the word united against the British, but not necessarily united one state of 13.
What did state mean when Stephen Moylan and then Thomas Jefferson wrote the United States of America? State meant a country. Interestingly, when Washington used the country, he meant Virginia, a colony. So it was a little nebulous. It wasn't quite clear. It is clear, however, that at the same time that the Congress started to debate a Declaration of Independence, they also asked John Dickinson and others to come up with what they eventually called Articles of Confederation. So they were planning to form a united confederation, a single entity with a national government, not as strong as the government we have today, but as some eventually that was called the Articles of Confederation Perpetual Union. So it was not just a temporary alliance. It was supposed to create a country, and yet they were still using the term state for each independent, what had been a colony or a province. So it was in this transitional period. Nowadays, we're very comfortable, being Americans, thinking of a state as part of the country. Back then, they were thinking of these as separate countries which could combine into a confederation.
So is the word state used in the Articles of Confederation?
Yes, they did. It was in 1776, they made this shift from United Colonies to United States, and they started to refer to each of these as states, unless, like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, you want to be fancy and be a commonwealth. But these were, they were started to use that terminology immediately. It's a strange thing because we still talk about, foreign states, heads of state. We still use the term both to mean a country and to mean a portion of a country. Yes, sir.
You had a slide showing what you called an olive branch letter.
Yes.
I counted only 9 colonies represented in that letter.
I could only show why were there only 9 colonies on the olive branch petition, 9 signatures. I could only show one side of the paper. Flipped over the paper, you get the Virginians, you get the others. There were only 12 colonies represented, however, because Georgia had not yet sent anybody to the Continental Congress. So there are 3 more on the other side, but not 4 more. In the back.
You mentioned that Massachusetts had the highest proportion of volunteers for the Continental Army.
Yes.
I assume they kind of made up both militia and actual Continental volunteers.
No, that's when I say the Army, I'm making a distinction between the militia, who were organized at the colony or state level, and they were called up only for emergencies or for a set period of time by the state or colonial government. If you were joining the Continental Army, you were signing up to the national government or this alliance, and you signed up for a longer period. And you signed up for basically wherever they sent you. Whereas the militias tended to be very defined as, okay, you're going to guard our coast, or you're going to go to one state over and guard their coast, but you're not going to be sent down to South Carolina if that happens to be where the war takes you. So becoming a member, enlisting in the Continental Army was more of a commitment, more of a show of support than being in the militia.
Well, I'm curious if you give us maybe a window into the mindset of what they thought they were fighting for kind of in those early months. Were they kind of looking for a bit of excitement? Were they fearful? Were they thinking about independence at that point?
If you're talking about individual soldiers, there were many motivations, just as there are these days. And so, yes, there were a lot of young men going off to, because their neighbors and their friends and their brothers and their cousins were going off, and it sounded like fun. There were men who were convinced that their rights as British citizens were under threat, and it was some of them created new governors. So John Hancock was governor of Massachusetts by the end of the war. George.
Can you talk a little bit about Washington's personal history of smallpox? Was he inoculated? Was there smallpox outbreaks in Mount Vernon?
He caught smallpox naturally. I think while he was visiting Bermuda. I forget where he was But he caught it naturally, and therefore he survived. Or well, he was lucky to survive. He had a mild case, but he still had scars. He still had pox scars on his face, which painters and sculptors do not try to replicate. But he was not. He had visibly survived smallpox. He had. He sometimes had inoculations done at Mount Vernon when he could spare people. And interestingly, inoculation was better established in Africa and parts of the Muslim world, Turkey, than it was in Britain. And so it was from people who had traveled or been forcibly traveled to America that Americans learned about smallpox inoculation in the early 1700s.
And Martha, was she had smallpox?
Martha was inoculated in early 1777 at the same time as the Army. Although interestingly, I just recently came across. There was somebody else. There were other scares of smallpox, and I recently was reading something from the Continental Congress delegate who said that the president of the Continental Congress at the time, his wife was down with smallpox, so it could show up. There's a moment in the John Adams's miniseries where Abigail and the children are inoculated against smallpox in early 1776, and that was at the right time, but that was not the right place. They showed it as the family in their home, all sick and wan and ailing and all by themselves. In fact, Abigail packed up the children, the servants, relatives, came into Boston, went to the hospital. It was a big deal. She did it right. And that's how they got inoculated. John Adams, who had, because of his profession as a lawyer, he was going to be doing more practicing. He's going to be meeting more people. He got himself inoculated in the early 1760s before he married Abigail. And one of the men who inoculated him, not the man who grabbed his arm, but the man who grabbed his friend's arm next to him, was Dr. Joseph Warren. So that's how they met. So smallpox inoculation, people understood it, people accepted it, but you had to do it right because it really involved catching this deadly contagious disease. So you wanted to make sure if your friend was getting smallpox inoculation and you were not naturally immune already, you wanted to make sure that he was inoculated far away. He kept far away and so on. And if there was any, if the procedure was slipshod, then there could actually be riots because it was seen as endangering the public health. Is there a question here? Yes, sir.
Is it true that the king ordered colonists, because they were colonists and therefore subjects of him, to open their homes to British soldiers?
Did the king or did the British government force colonists to house soldiers?
That would have been a good reason to revolt against him.
It would have been, but no, he didn't. The Quartering Act of 1765, which was then revised in 1774, it required the local government to provide housing for soldiers in barracks or in unoccupied public houses, public buildings. There was no attempt to make individual people, house soldiers in peacetime. In wartime, once the war started, both armies did that on an emergency basis. And in fact, our constitutional protection against quartering, the Third Amendment, it only takes effect in peacetime. So we are still subject, if there is ever war, and the army is coming down from the Canadian army is coming down.
But only by act of Congress.
There's still, yes, but I mean that's the government can do it. There was a lot of argument in Boston in 1768 when the British soldiers arrived over quartering, over how the town was required to provide housing and firewood for the soldiers. The town, its argument was, we have provided barracks. We have barracks empty and waiting for you. on Castle Island, out in the middle of Boston Harbor, miles from where the trouble will be. And that didn't fly. And so the royal government was housing soldiers in Faneuil Hall for a while and other government buildings. And eventually the army rented a bunch of unused warehouses and still houses for the soldiers. And so when the Boston Massacre took place, these soldiers were in town and they were living in these big buildings, but they were not living in private houses. And so that is a common myth. That's a common misunderstanding of the way the quartering works.
So there was no basis for the Third Amendment?
The basis for the Third Amendment was in the English Civil War of the mid-1600s. A lot of what Americans felt were fundamental rights were responses to what had happened in that English Civil War, which were then put into what was called the Bill of Rights in the reign of William and Mary, when at the end of the 1600s, this new, more reformist monarchy came into power in Britain. When Americans saw the Constitution and saw that some of these rights were not in there, that's why they said, we want a Bill of Rights. We want some of these traditional, what had been British rights, but which we now think of as deserving to be American rights, codified in writing. And so, yes, they were responding to a real problem of quartering soldiers in private homes, but it wasn't a problem that happened here in America, and it wasn't a problem that happened in the 18th century. It was way back, and they just didn't want that to happen again. Same thing with some of the other rights discussed in the Bill of Rights. Yeah.
Did any loyalists stick around in this period, or did everyone?
Did any
Loyalists?
loyalists stick around? There were some loyalists who decided to take a chance on staying in Boston or in Massachusetts. There were a few who, as this great fleet sailed up to Halifax, their ships did not get on well, and they were actually shipwrecked and captured. There's just a great spectrum of experiences. So some men were, some of the men who had been recaptured were put into jail and ended up having to argue their way out, or some then left. There were some men who went away in March 1776 and came back in the 1780s and reunited with their families, or tried to reunite with their families and couldn't. So every possible experience really was there.
Washington had spies who pretended to be loyalists and who listened to the conversation of real loyalists and reported back to him what they had said and who they were and where they lived.
There were, and the uncle of the man who owned this house, John Vassall, his uncle William Vassall, he was a loyalist. He went away. He kept suing to get his property in America back. He was successful enough at certain lower court levels, and eventually the Supreme Court made a decision in a case brought by him and a similar case brought by somebody else, which Congress thought was so bad. That's what the 11th Amendment was for. It was overturning this Supreme Court decision in favor of William Vassall. So this family itself is partly responsible for one of our amendments to the Constitution, because William Vassall, as a scholar named Caitlin G. Angeles does a lot of work on him, he would complain and sue about anything. And so leaving Massachusetts and becoming a loyalist, that simply changed the target of his suits and his complaints, but it didn't change how much he sued and complained. One of the families I study most interestingly is the Gore family, which is represented by Gore Place out in Waltham. Christopher Gore's father was a loyalist who left in March 1776, spent a decade in London, and came back in 1786. And because he had so many relatives in Boston who had been part of the Patriot movement, he was welcomed back. Other men, including the man he left with, were not welcomed back. So it was all very personal.
Which leads me to another question. Was anybody actually punished under the Banishment Act?
Was anyone actually punished under the Banishment Act? Yes, I mean, they were banished. I mean, well, the way Massachusetts wrote its anti-loyalist laws was there was one law which said if you are one of these, and then they listed all these men who were royal officials, then you are not welcome and your property is confiscated. The other act is actually called an act about absentees. These were not people who had actually served the British government, but they were gone during the war, having left after the beginning of the war, and therefore they were presumed to be loyalist, and their property was also confiscated. So the reason this house stopped being the John Vassall house is because John Vassall was in London and then Bath, living off his Jamaican property. And so this estate was confiscated by the state and then sold off for the benefit of paying for the war.
And that was under this second act.
That was under the Absentee Act because John Vassall just barely managed to avoid being a royal official. So most of the Tory Row mansions were owned by absentees and confiscated during the war and sold to new owners. The one that is not is the Fairweather house down this way, about a mile and a quarter. And Fairweather had made a swap with a loyalist who was living there. So they swapped houses. He got the Cambridge house. The loyalist Royal got a house in Boston. He left with the British, and that house was confiscated. Everything else.
The Royal House in Bedford?
The Royal House, that's a different
Oh,
name. Sorry. The Royal House in Medford, same situation. Isaac Royal was an absentee. He was also a Massachusetts council member. So he was under both laws. It was confiscated and it ended up in somebody else's property. Let's see. Trying to think if there are other stories. Well, there are so many stories of loyalists because everyone had a slightly different situation.
so did they leave without their families?
Some John Gore left without his family. He left with his late son's daughter and her little boy. And but he left his wife behind, he left his sons behind, he left his daughters behind, the sons-in-law, and so on. So he left most of the family away. Other people came with their whole families.
So if their property was confiscated, these people had a hard time supporting them.
Well, yes, but as it worked out, if you had left family behind, like down here, there's the Brattle House, which is now part of the Cambridge Center for Adult Education. General Brattle left. His daughter-in-law, I think his married daughter, was in that house, widowed daughter. And she kept a hold of it. And she made friends with the Patriot authorities. And she made sure that was not confiscated. And that stayed in the family. Penelope Vassall, who was another member of this family that owned this house, she lived another house down. She was able to argue that because she was a woman, she had not been political and therefore should not have her property confiscated. Politics. If you were able to leave behind members of the family, it was a lot more awkward and a lot more legally tedious for the state to confiscate your property. So families that were divided actually came out better than families that said, oh, we'll all stick together. Down this direction, the Royal Attorney General, Jonathan Sewell, lived with his wife and children. She was a Quincy. She was probably sympathetic to the Patriots. She was the sister of John Hancock's wife, Dolly Quincy. She did not want to leave, but he was a top royal official, and so he had to leave. And so she had a rather sad life because they went away. And there were other people, another Quincy, Samuel Quincy, who was another royal official. He went away without his wife because she liked it here, and she had a happy time. And he was lost at sea eventually. So again, there are all these different stories. John Singleton Copley had an interesting situation because he had left Boston in 1774 after the Tea Party, which had made him somewhat unpopular and nervous, but he was going to Europe to study painting. And he argued that therefore his property should not be confiscated. And because he had left, but he hadn't left according to during the wartime. So he got to sell his property on Beacon Hill for what he thought was a good price. And then he discovered that there was development on Beacon Hill, and it was a bargain price. And he spent years sending his lawyer's son over to Massachusetts trying to argue that this was unfair in some way. And of course it didn't work. But so all sorts of different possibilities. One last question?
Last brief question. And then...
Okay, sir.
When the British ships left Boston, did any American ship captains chase after them?
Yes and no. There were so many ships, and they were guarded by the Royal Navy and other armed ships, that you did not want to go to the main bulk of those ships. But if there were stragglers, if some ran into trouble and came close to shore, then yes, there were enough privateers to go after those. And that's how some of these loyalists were captured and brought back to the Boston jail. But you did not, basically the only, especially this time of the war, the only British ships that you went close to were on their own. The Royal Navy was just too strong. American ships tried to stay away from the Royal Navy as much as possible. So,
When is the last time that American ships and British ships exchanged fire with each other?
could be the War of 1812, but it could be sometime in the Civil War, because there was the British government was trying to play both sides during the Civil War. But I'm not certain. I have a very narrow focus in my history, which is really New England Revolutionary War history, especially towards the beginning. So you asked me about 1785. I may or may not know. All right, thank you all very much. Happy to talk more with folks, people, and hope you have a good dinner and enjoy Evacuation Day season.